12 years of guiding tourists through these mountains meant I could navigate every trail with my eyes closed. The northern Rockies stretched endlessly around us, pine forests so thick they blocked most of the sky, with peaks that disappeared into low clouds. My latest group consisted of 8 people, all eager to experience what they called real wilderness, though most had never spent more than a weekend camping in their lives. David Martinez walked just behind me on the narrow trail, his strong frame handling the terrain better than most software engineers I'd guided. His wife Sarah followed close behind, occasionally stopping to photograph wildflowers or interesting rock formations. Their 16-year-old daughter Emily bounced between the front and back of the group, her energy seemingly endless as she peppered me with questions about everything from bear safety to local geology. The remaining 5 tourists formed the rest of our party: a retired couple from Ontario, 2 college friends from Vancouver, and a solo hiker who joined us at the last minute. Everyone seemed enthusiastic about the experience, which made my job considerably easier. Nothing worse than dragging reluctant city dwellers through terrain they'd rather avoid. We'd covered nearly 40 kilometers over the past 3 days, and I couldn't have asked for better conditions. The weather held steady with cool mornings that warmed to perfect hiking temperatures by midday. No rain, minimal wind, and visibility that let us appreciate the massive scope of the landscape around us. The group had bonded well, sharing meals and stories around our campfires each evening. David proved to be practical and organized, always checking his GPS and helping other hikers adjust their packs. Sarah brought a nurturing quality to the group, offering snacks and bandages whenever someone needed them. Emily's curiosity reminded me why I'd started guiding in the first place. Watching people discover the raw beauty of places most would never see. By our 4th morning, we'd reached one of my favorite camping spots near a creek that wound through a small valley. The water ran clear and cold, perfect for refilling our bottles and washing off trail dust. Tall pines surrounded the area, creating natural windbreaks, while still allowing enough open space for our tents. I was helping the retired couple set up their tent when Emily called out from the creek bank, "Hey, everyone should come look at this." Her voice carried excitement mixed with confusion, the tone that usually meant she'd found something interesting. The group gathered around her as she pointed toward the muddy ground near the water's edge. "What do you think made this?" I moved closer to examine what she'd discovered, and my stomach dropped. Pressed deep into the soft earth was a footprint unlike anything I'd seen in over a decade of guiding. The impression measured nearly 2 feet in length and stretched about 8 inches wide. 5 distinct toe marks were clearly visible, each one larger than a human thumb. "That's really big," Sarah said, crouching down to get a better look. David pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. "Has to be a hoax," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone's messing with hikers." I knelt beside the print, looking at how deep and clear it was. The edges stayed sharp and clean, showing it had been made recently. The mark went at least 3 inches into the mud, meaning whatever made it was really heavy. Most importantly, the size looked wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. "The nearest trail access is 15 kilometers from here," I said. Pretty elaborate setup for a practical joke. Emily pulled out her camera and started taking photos from different angles. "Could it be a bear?" she asked. "Wrong shape entirely. Bear paws don't look anything like this." The college student suggested it might belong to a mountain man or hermit living off the grid. The retired couple guessed it could be from some unknown species. Everyone had theories, but I found myself looking at the print with growing worry. Something about the toe arrangement bothered me. They looked almost human in their layout, but way too big. No person could leave a print this size, yet the basic structure seemed known. The contradiction made no sense. Sarah took several more photos before we moved away from the creek to finish setting up camp. The group's energy stayed high as they talked about their discovery over lunch, but I had trouble focusing on their conversation. That footprint filled my thoughts completely. Throughout the afternoon, I caught myself looking back toward the creek bank where Emily had made her discovery. The print seemed to pull at my attention, wanting explanations I couldn't give. I'd guided hundreds of people through these mountains and seen every type of wildlife that called this region home. Nothing in my experience could explain what we'd found. The group spent the rest of the day exploring the immediate area, hoping to find more prints or other signs of whatever had passed through. Their search turned up nothing except normal animal tracks and the usual forest debris. David documented everything with his GPS, marking the exact coordinates of our discovery. Evening brought its usual routine of dinner preparation and camp maintenance, but I moved through the tasks automatically. My mind kept going back to that footprint, thinking over every detail I could remember. The depth suggested something heavy. The shape meant something walking upright. The size ruled out every known animal in the region. After everyone settled into their tents for the night, I stayed by the dying campfire longer than usual. The forest around us felt different somehow, though I couldn't figure out what had changed. Every rustling branch and distant animal call seemed louder in the darkness. I checked the area around our campsite 3 times before finally going to my tent, something I'd never done in 12 years of guiding. Each walk around showed nothing unusual, but the worry kept building in my chest. Whatever had left that print might still be in the area, moving through the same forest where 8 people lay sleeping in thin nylon shelters. Sleep came in brief, restless bits. Every few hours I found myself listening carefully to the sounds outside my tent, trying to tell normal forest noise from anything that might mean we weren't alone. The night passed slowly, filled with a tension I couldn't shake or explain. I woke with my mind already made up about one thing. We weren't staying near that creek another minute longer than necessary. The group stirred around me as dawn came through the pine trees, and I moved through my morning routine of checking gear and preparing breakfast. My hands stayed busy while my thoughts went over the previous day's discovery. That footprint had left me worried, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something that had no business existing in these mountains. "Change of plans for today," I announced as everyone gathered around the camp stove for coffee and oatmeal. "We're heading northeast toward Glacier Point instead of following the creek route." The retired couple from Ontario looked disappointed immediately. The woman, Margaret, had been particularly excited about photographing the waterfall that lay further upstream. "But the map shows such beautiful terrain along the water," she said, spreading her hiking guide across her lap. "We were hoping to see those rock formations you mentioned yesterday." Her husband nodded in agreement, already pulling out his own trail maps. "Seems like we're making good time. Why not stick to the original plan?" The 2 college friends voiced similar protests, and even the solo hiker who joined us last minute seemed confused by the sudden change. I stirred my oatmeal slowly, buying time to come up with an explanation that wouldn't show my growing worry about what might be hiding in the area. "Weather reports are showing possible storms moving in from the west," I said, the lie coming easier than I'd expected. "The northeast route keeps us on higher ground with better shelter options if we need to wait anything out." Sarah looked up from where she was organizing their family's day packs. "The forecast seemed pretty clear when I checked it yesterday evening." "Mountain weather changes fast," I replied, meeting her concerned look. "Better to stay flexible and keep our options open." David hadn't said anything during the discussion, but I noticed him checking his GPS device and studying our current coordinates. His usual morning energy seemed less, replaced by a thoughtful quiet that hadn't been there before yesterday's discovery. He'd taken dozens of photos of that footprint, examining every angle and detail with the careful approach of someone trying to solve a puzzle. After breakfast, I led the group through the process of breaking camp and loading their packs. Everyone moved with the efficiency that comes from several days of shared routine, but I could sense their disappointment about the route change. Margaret kept looking toward the creek with obvious longing, while the college students discussed the formations they'd missed seeing. We set off northeast as the morning air warmed around us, following a trail that wound through increasingly dense forest. The terrain proved more challenging than our previous days, with steeper inclines and rockier footing that demanded more attention and energy from the group. I found myself grateful for the distraction of difficult hiking, though it didn't completely quiet the worry that had settled in my chest. Throughout the morning, I caught myself doing things I'd never done in 12 years of guiding. My eyes checked the tree line constantly, searching for movement or shapes that didn't belong. I stopped frequently under the pretense of checking the group's pace, but really I was listening for sounds that might indicate we were being followed. Every snapping branch or rustling bush made me tense until I could identify the source. David remained unusually quiet during our first rest break, sitting slightly apart from the others while they shared snacks and compared photos from the morning's hike. When Emily asked him about something she'd spotted in the cover above us, he gave short, distracted answers that weren't typical of his usual engaged parenting style. "You feeling all right?" Sarah asked him during our midday stop for lunch. "Fine," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Just thinking about that print we found yesterday." "It was probably just an old impression from some passing animal," she replied, though her voice carried its own uncertainty. "Right, Michael?" I looked up from my map, where I'd been planning our afternoon route with more care than necessary. "Most likely explanation," I said, though privately I couldn't convince myself of that anymore. The afternoon brought us to the new campsite I'd picked, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that created natural walls around our temporary home. The space felt more closed in than our previous stops, with limited sight lines beyond the immediate area. Under normal circumstances, I might have preferred something more open, but today the closed-in feeling brought a sense of security I desperately wanted. We established our evening routine with practiced efficiency, though I noticed everyone seemed more tired than usual after the challenging terrain. The college students went to bed earlier than they had on previous nights, and even Emily's energy seemed drained as she helped her parents organize their gear. David spent extra time that evening reviewing the photos he'd taken of the footprint, studying them on his phone's screen with an intensity that suggested he was looking for details he might have missed. When Sarah asked what he hoped to find, he just shook his head and put the device away. I kept the campfire going longer than necessary, using the need for light as an excuse to avoid retreating to my tent. The forest around us felt different tonight, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. The usual symphony of night sounds seemed muted, with longer gaps of silence between the calls of owls and other nocturnal creatures. Eventually, exhaustion won over anxiety, and I banked the fire before crawling into my sleeping bag. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of massive footprints and shadows moving between trees. I'd surface periodically to listen to the forest around us, then drift off again into restless unconsciousness. Then, sometime around midnight, a sound cut through the darkness that made every muscle in my body go rigid. The cry of an infant bounced through the forest, high-pitched and desperate, carrying clearly through the still night air. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag as the sound continued. The crying came from somewhere beyond our campsite, probably several hundred yards away, but close enough that every wail reached us with crystal clarity. Something about the sound felt fundamentally wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what triggered that instinct. The pitch seemed right for a baby in distress, and the rhythm matched what I'd expect from an infant calling for help. but it carried too far through the forest, as if it had been designed specifically to travel long distances and attract attention. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should investigate. Years of wilderness training had conditioned me to respond to distress calls, to help anyone who might be injured or lost in the mountains. A baby crying alone in the forest should have sent me charging through the trees with my headlamp and first aid kit. Instead, I remained perfectly motionless, gripped by a fear so primal and absolute that it overrode every instinct I'd developed as a guide. Something deep in my brain, some old survival mechanism, recognized danger in that sound and refused to let me move toward it. The crying continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. The sound never varied in intensity or pitch, keeping the same desperate quality without the natural fluctuations I'd expect from a real infant. It stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt thick and oppressive. I strained my ears for any other sounds, footsteps, voices, anything that might indicate people were out there searching for the source of the crying. The forest remained completely quiet, as if every living creature had retreated into hiding after hearing that sound. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours until dawn, lying rigid in my sleeping bag, listening for any indication that whatever had made that sound was moving closer to our camp. Every small noise made me tense, but the forest gradually returned to its normal nighttime rhythms as the hours passed. When morning light finally filtered through the tent walls, I emerged to find the rest of the group stirring with their usual camping routine. I moved through the process of rekindling the fire and preparing breakfast, desperate to gauge whether anyone else had heard what I'd experienced. "Everyone sleep well?" I asked as people gathered around the camp stove with their coffee cups. David looked up right away, his expression alert in a way that suggested he hadn't slept much either. "Did anyone else hear crying last night?" Sarah nodded, wrapping her hands around her mug. "Around midnight, maybe. It sounded like a baby, but that doesn't make any sense out here." "I heard it too," Margaret said. "Woke my husband up to ask if he thought we should do something about it." Her husband confirmed hearing the sound, and the college students both admitted it had disturbed their sleep as well. Only Emily claimed to have slept through the entire night. "You didn't hear anything?" Sarah asked her daughter. Emily shook her head, looking genuinely confused by the discussion. "I was completely out until this morning." "What kind of crying?" David described the sound in detail, and I watched Emily's face as she listened. Her confusion appeared real, though I found it strange that such a loud, persistent noise hadn't woken her when it had affected everyone else in the group. "Sound travels strangely in the mountains," I said, falling back on the same explanation I'd used countless times with previous groups. "Acoustics can carry noise much further than you'd expect, especially at night when the air is still and cool." The explanation satisfied most of the group, but I caught David watching me with a questioning look that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd heard the same wrongness in that sound that had kept me frozen in my tent, and no amount of talk about mountain acoustics would address the gut-level fear it had triggered. As we prepared to break camp for another day of hiking, I found myself studying the tree line around our clearing more carefully. Whatever had made that sound knew we were here, and the thought of it watching us from the shadows beyond our sight made my skin crawl. The knowledge that no baby existed within 50 miles of our current location weighed on me as I shouldered my pack and prepared to lead the group deeper into the wilderness. My hands moved through the usual routine of getting the fire going and unpacking the camp stove, but something felt wrong before I even looked around the clearing. The silence was too complete, missing the usual sounds of David moving around his family's tent or the soft talking that normally came with our morning wake-up. I looked toward the Martinez family's tent and stopped breathing. The blue nylon fabric hung in torn pieces along one side, great big rips that showed the interior like wounds. Dark stains covered the ground in a wide circle around the collapsed structure, and what looked like drag marks carved deep grooves in the soft earth leading toward the river. "David?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response came from the destroyed tent. I set down the coffee pot and moved closer, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The damage became more terrible as I got nearer. Those weren't small tears from a branch or equipment breaking. Something had ripped through the tent wall on purpose, leaving jagged edges that looked like claws or teeth had made them. Sarah's scream cut through the morning air. "David, oh God, David!" Her voice came from inside the ruined tent, high and frantic. Within seconds, every member of our group was stumbling out of their sleeping bags and heading toward the scene. I reached the tent first and found Sarah kneeling in the wreckage, her hands covered in something dark that I didn't want to identify. "Where is he?" she demanded, looking up at me with wild eyes. "Where's my husband?" Emily pushed past me into the tent, her face going white as she took in the scene. Blood soaked the sleeping bags and splattered the interior walls in patterns that made my stomach lurch. David's GPS device lay in the corner next to his radio, both items undamaged but surrounded by more blood than I'd ever seen at any campsite in 12 years of guiding. "Everyone stay back," I said, though my voice came out weak and shaky. "Don't touch anything." But Emily was already crawling deeper into the tent, calling for her father with increasing worry. Sarah followed her daughter, both of them frantically searching through the bloody fabric and gear as if David might somehow be hidden beneath the mess. I forced myself to look at the drag marks leading away from the tent. They cut through the soft earth in two parallel lines, each about 8 inches wide, along with those same massive footprints we'd found at the creek. The impressions were even clearer here in the churned mud around the campsite, showing every detail of those impossible toes. Margaret appeared beside me, her face pale as she looked at the tracks. "What could do this?" she whispered. I had no answer for her. The college students hung back near their own tent, both looking sick. The solo hiker was already stuffing his gear into his pack with shaking hands, ready to take off. "David!" Sarah's voice echoed through the forest as she stumbled out of the tent and began following the drag marks toward the river. "David, answer me!" "Sarah, stop," I called after her, but she was already 20 yards away and moving fast. Emily came out of the tent with her father's GPS device pressed against her chest. "He wouldn't leave this behind," she said, her voice empty with shock. "Dad never goes anywhere without his GPS." I looked at the device in her hands, then back at the radio still lying in the bloody tent. David was the most prepared person I'd ever guided, someone who checked his equipment twice and always carried backup gear. He wouldn't abandon his most important items unless something had stopped him from taking them. Sarah's voice kept calling from the direction of the river, her shouts getting more frantic each time. I knew I should go after her, but seeing those footprints leading into the forest made every survival instinct tell me to move in the opposite direction. "We need to leave," I said to the group. "Right now." "Are you insane?" Emily spun toward me, her face flushed with anger. "My father is missing. We're not going anywhere." Margaret's husband was examining the tent fabric with the careful attention of someone trying to understand what kind of force could create such damage. "These tears look like they were made by something with claws," he said quietly. "Bears don't drag people away," one of the college students said, "and they definitely don't leave footprints like those." The solo hiker had finished packing and stood with his loaded pack, clearly ready to take off. "I'm not staying here another minute," he announced. Whatever did this might come back. Sarah returned from the river looking even more panicked, mud streaking her clothes and face. I can't find any trace of him past the water's edge, she said. The trail just stops. Because we're leaving immediately, I said, trying to project authority I didn't feel. Everyone pack your essential gear. We're hiking out to get help. No? Emily stepped between me and the destroyed tent. We're not leaving without Dad. Emily, be reasonable, I said. Your father needs professional search and rescue, not a group of tourists stumbling around in the woods. Then call them on the radio, she shot back, pointing at the device still lying in the bloody tent. I retrieved the radio and tried multiple channels, but the static remained unchanged from previous attempts. The mountains blocked most signals, and our current location was too remote for reliable communication with the outside world. The nearest cell tower is 2 days' hike from here, I explained. We need to reach town to get help. Sarah shook her head hard. I'm not leaving this area. David could be hurt calling for help if we leave him now. Her voice broke, and Emily moved to put an arm around her mother. Both women looked at me in a way that made it clear they had no intention of following my guidance, regardless of the danger. The retired couple exchanged worried looks, and Margaret spoke up. Maybe we could split up. Some of us go for help while others stay to search. Absolutely not, I said. Whatever happened here, it's not safe to divide the group. But I could see the determination in Sarah and Emily's faces. They weren't going to give up their search, no matter what arguments I made. The solo hiker was already walking toward the trail that headed back toward civilization, and the college students looked torn between following him and staying with the group. After 10 minutes of increasingly heated discussion, I made the hardest decision of my guiding career. I'm leaving my GPS and radio with you, I told Sarah, pulling both devices from my pack. The GPS has all our waypoints marked, including the route back to town. The radio might work better from higher elevation. You're leaving us? Emily asked, her voice filled with disbelief. I'm taking everyone who's willing to go and getting professional help as fast as possible, I said. Search and rescue teams have equipment and experience we don't have. That's your father's best chance. Sarah clutched the GPS against her chest. How long until they get here? 2 days to reach town, then however long it takes to organize a helicopter rescue, I said. Maybe 3 days total. The college students decided to come with me, along with the retired couple. Only Sarah and Emily remained behind, sitting beside the destroyed tent with my GPS and radio while they planned their own search efforts. I led the remaining 5 members of our group away from that clearing. Every step felt like abandonment, but I knew getting professional help was the only realistic option. The 2-day hike that should have been easy became a forced march as I pushed everyone to cover ground as quickly as possible. We stopped only for water and brief rest breaks, hiking well past sunset on the first day and starting again before dawn on the second. The college students complained about the pace, but the retired couple somehow kept up through pure determination. Everyone understood the urgency, even if I couldn't explain the full extent of my fears about what we'd left behind. When we finally reached the small town that served as our staging area, I was running on adrenaline and desperation. The group stumbled toward the local inn like refugees, exhausted and traumatized by what we'd witnessed. I found the nearest payphone and dialed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police emergency line. This is Michael Thompson, Wilderness Guide License number 4471, I said when the dispatcher answered. I need to report a missing person and request immediate search and rescue operations. The questions came fast. Location, circumstances, number of people involved, medical conditions. I provided David's coordinates from memory and described the destroyed campsite without mentioning the footprints or my suspicions about what might have caused the incident. Helicopters will be dispatched within the hour, the dispatcher assured me. We'll have teams on site before nightfall. There are 2 family members still in the area, I said. His wife and daughter refused to evacuate. Understood. We'll locate them and ensure their safety as part of the operation. After providing additional details and contact information, I hung up and slumped against the phone booth wall. The known sounds of civilization, cars, voices, radio music from nearby shops, felt surreal after the silence of the forest. 3 hours later, a RCMP officer arrived at the inn to take my formal statement. I described the timeline of events, the condition of the campsite, and my decision to evacuate part of the group while leaving the family behind to await rescue. You did the right thing, the officer assured me. Professional search teams have the equipment and training to handle these situations safely. Any word from the helicopter crews? I asked. They're still conducting the search. We'll contact you as soon as we have an update. The officer left me with instructions to remain available for additional questioning and to get some rest. I checked into a room at the inn, but sleep proved impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those massive footprints leading away from David's destroyed tent, or remembered the wrongness in that infant's cry from the night before. At midnight, the phone in my room rang. I answered on the first ring, hoping for news about the search operation. Mr. Thompson, this is Sergeant Collins with the RCMP. We need you to return home immediately and remain available for further investigation. You'll be contacted within the next few days regarding this incident. Did you find them? I asked. David and his family? A long pause. We'll be in touch soon. Please go directly home and wait for further contact. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone with a growing feeling that something had gone very wrong with the rescue operation. 2 weeks had passed since I'd stumbled out of those mountains, but my apartment in Vancouver felt more like a prison than a refuge. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of shredded blue nylon and drag marks carved deep into soft earth. Every unexpected sound made me jump. A door slamming in the hallway, a motorcycle backfiring on the street below, even the coffee maker's morning noise. My hands shook when I tried to hold a cup steady, and I'd caught myself checking the locks on my door multiple times each night before attempting sleep. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a bowl of cereal that had gone soggy 20 minutes earlier. The phone's ring cut through the silence like an alarm, making me spill coffee across the newspaper I wasn't really reading. Michael Thompson? The voice was professional, measured. Yes. This is Detective William Harris with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I need you to come in for questioning regarding the incident in the Northern Rockies 2 weeks ago. My stomach dropped. Did you find them? We'll discuss everything when you get here. Can you be at our Vancouver office this afternoon? 2 o'clock. The address he gave me was downtown, in one of those government buildings that looked like concrete boxes designed to intimidate anyone who walked through the doors. I spent the rest of the morning pacing my apartment, trying to prepare myself for whatever news he might deliver about David, Sarah, and Emily. The RCMP building felt exactly as unwelcoming as it looked from the outside. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white glare that made my headache worse. A receptionist directed me to the 3rd floor, where Detective Harris waited in a small room that smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. Harris looked like he'd stepped out of a police procedural, mid-40s, graying hair cut short, wearing a suit that had seen better days. His eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much bad news delivered in rooms like this one. He pointed for me to take the plastic chair across from a metal table that had been bolted to the floor. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Thompson. I know this has been a difficult time. I sat down carefully, my legs still feeling unsteady. Have you found the Martinez family? Harris opened a manila folder and pulled out several photographs, setting them face down on the table between us. We located all 3 bodies yesterday morning. They were discovered about 200 meters from the campsite you described, near the riverbank. The words hit me hard. Even though I'd expected the worst, hearing it confirmed made the room feel smaller, the air thinner. All 3? I managed to ask. David, Sarah, and Emily Martinez. Yes. Harris watched my reaction carefully, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp with attention. I probably looked like someone had gut-punched me, which wasn't far from how I felt. The official report will cite a bear attack, he continued. But before we proceed with that determination, I need you to view some recovered footage. Footage? Your GPS device was found with the bodies. It had been recording video during the final incident. Harris reached into his folder and produced a small digital camera connected to a laptop computer. I need to warn you that this material is extremely disturbing. Are you prepared to view it? No part of me wanted to see whatever had happened to that family, but I nodded anyway. Harris positioned the laptop screen so I could see it clearly, then pressed play. The video started with shaky handheld footage, clearly shot at night with limited visibility beyond the reach of a flashlight beam. I could hear David's voice in the background, low and tense. Stay close behind me, Em. Keep the light steady. Emily's breathing was loud as she held the GPS device. The camera pointed ahead toward her father's back. David carried what looked like a hunting rifle in one hand and a flashlight in the other, sweeping the beam across the forest floor as they moved deeper into the trees. The sound started almost immediately. That same infant crying I'd heard 2 nights before they disappeared. But on the recording, it was much clearer, more distinct. The wailing carried through the darkness with perfect clarity, rising and falling in patterns that sounded exactly like a baby in distress. It's coming from those fallen trees, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. The camera followed his movement toward a cluster of massive pine trunks that had toppled across each other, creating a natural shelter or den. The crying grew louder as they approached, the sound so realistic and heartbreaking that every instinct screamed at them to help whatever child was making those desperate sounds. David raised his rifle as they reached the edge of the fallen timber, his flashlight beam checking the shadows between the logs. For a moment, the camera caught what looked like a bundle of cloth or fabric tucked deep in the wooden shelter. Then the creature came out. My stomach turned as I watched something that shouldn't exist unfold itself from behind the fallen trees. The thing stood nearly 10 feet tall, its pale skin stretched tight over an impossibly long body. Arms hung down past where knees should be, ending in fingers that looked more like bone than flesh. Its head sat at a wrong angle, on a neck that bent in ways human anatomy couldn't accommodate. But it was the complete absence of hair that made it truly horrible. Not a single strand anywhere on its body, leaving the skin looking raw and exposed under David's flashlight beam. The creature moved with smooth precision that suggested intelligence, purpose, predatory calculation. David fired the rifle. The sound exploded through the laptop speakers, making me jump backward in my chair. But the creature had already moved, covering the distance between the trees and David in what looked like a single bound. The camera spun wildly as Emily screamed, catching glimpses of movement too fast to follow clearly. The footage ended abruptly in static. I stared at the blank screen, my mouth dry and my hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough to hurt. Harris reached over and closed the laptop carefully. The crying sounds were likely the creature's hunting method, he said, his voice matter-of-fact despite the horror we just witnessed. It mimics infant distress calls to lure potential victims into range. We found evidence of similar tactics being used in 3 other disappearances over the past 5 years. 3 others? I looked up at him, trying to process what he'd just told me. Hikers who went missing after reporting strange sounds in the wilderness. We think this thing has been hunting in the northern Rockies for some time, but the Martinez incident is the first time we've recovered actual footage of an attack. Harris leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction. The official story will remain bear attack to prevent public panic. The last thing we need is amateur hunters and curiosity seekers flooding those mountains with guns and cameras. I thought about the crying I'd heard that night, and how every part of me had told me not to go check out the sound. Some old part of my brain had recognized the trap, even when I couldn't figure out what was wrong. What about their families? Don't they deserve to know what really happened? They'll be told their loved ones died in a tragic wildlife encounter, which is essentially true. The specific details serve no purpose except to traumatize people who are already grieving. Harris pulled out a document and slid it across the table toward me. I need you to sign a confidentiality agreement. What you've seen today is classified information. Discussing it with anyone outside law enforcement would result in serious criminal charges. The paper was dense with legal language, but the message was clear. Keep my mouth shut or face prosecution. I read through the key sections, my hands still shaking slightly from what I'd witnessed on that recording. You're asking me to lie about what happened to my clients. I'm asking you to protect public safety by not discussing classified information about an ongoing investigation. Harris's tone left no room for negotiation. This wasn't a request. It was a direct order backed by the full weight of federal law enforcement. I signed the document and slid it back across the table, feeling like I was closing off the last chance David, Sarah, and Emily would ever have for people to know how they really died. Are there any other questions about the incident that I can clarify for you? Just one, I said, meeting his eyes. Is that thing still out there? Harris closed the folder and stood up, showing that our interview was over. That's outside the scope of your involvement, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for your cooperation. I walked out of that RCMP building and drove straight to the guiding company's headquarters in downtown Vancouver. My hands still shook as I filled out the resignation paperwork at the front desk, barely able to keep my pen steady enough to sign my name. 12 years of wilderness guiding ended with a 2-sentence letter that cited personal circumstances and requested immediate termination of my employment. The receptionist, a woman I'd known for 8 years, asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine and left the building without collecting my final paycheck or cleaning out my office locker. The thought of discussing trail routes or equipment maintenance with my former colleagues made my stomach turn. Vancouver became my prison for the next 6 months. I picked up whatever work I could find, dishwashing at a restaurant downtown, stocking shelves at a grocery store, painting apartments for a property management company. None of it mattered. The jobs were just ways to fill the hours between sleepless nights when that creature's image played behind my closed eyelids like a broken movie reel. The pale skin stretched tight over impossible bones, arms that hung past where knees should be, the smooth way it moved as it came out from behind those fallen trees. David's rifle shot bouncing through the laptop speakers before the footage dissolved into static and screaming. I tried everything to push those images away. Alcohol made them worse, turning nightmares into waking hallucinations where I'd see stretched shadows moving across my apartment walls. Exercise helped temporarily, but as soon as I stopped running or lifting weights, my mind returned to that forest clearing and what had torn through blue nylon like tissue paper. The research started as an accident. I was Googling Northern Rockies missing hikers during a break at the grocery store telling myself I was looking for news about the official investigation. Instead, I found forum posts from amateur researchers discussing unexplained disappearances across British Columbia and Alberta, hikers who'd vanished without a trace, campsites found destroyed with no logical explanation for the damage. One post described a family of 4 who disappeared near Jasper National Park 3 years earlier. Their tents had been shredded, personal belongings scattered across the campsite, but no bodies were ever recovered. Another mentioned a solo hiker whose abandoned camp showed signs of a violent struggle, with drag marks leading toward dense forest that search teams couldn't get through. I started saving every article, every forum discussion, every news report about missing persons in the mountain regions. My apartment filled with printed maps where I marked locations with red pins, creating patterns that might indicate movement or territory. The creature from the footage couldn't be the only one. Nothing that size could survive alone for years without others of its kind. Late at night, I'd spread those maps across my kitchen table and trace possible migration routes between disappearance sites. The red pins formed rough clusters around remote wilderness areas, places where something could hunt without being detected by park rangers or search teams. The northern Rockies showed the highest concentration of incidents, but similar patterns came up around the coast mountains and parts of the Canadian Rockies. My laptop browser history became an archive of conspiracy forums, cryptozoology websites, and government databases of missing persons. I read everything: credible research, obvious nonsense, first-hand accounts that sounded too detailed to be hoaxes. Most of it was garbage, but buried in the paranoid rambling and blurry photographs were descriptions that matched what I'd seen on Detective Harris's footage. Something tall and pale moving through trees at impossible speed. Sounds of infants crying from places where no children should exist. Campsites torn apart by forces that left claw marks too large for any known predator.
The need to return to those mountains grew stronger every day. It started as curiosity, wondering if the creature had moved on, if other hikers were at risk, if there were more of them hunting in areas I'd guided tourists through for over a decade. But the curiosity changed into something deeper, more desperate. I couldn't function in normal life knowing that thing was still out there, possibly stalking new victims while I stocked canned goods and pretended everything was fine. After 6 months of research and sleepless nights, I called the same outfitter who'd supplied gear for my guiding trips and booked a solo camping package. 3 days in the northern Rockies, basic equipment rental, trail permits for the general area where David Martinez had died. The clerk recognized my voice and asked if I was getting back into guiding. I told her I was considering it and hung up before she could ask more questions. The drive north from Vancouver felt like traveling backward through time. City traffic gave way to suburbs, then small towns, then the endless pine forests that stretched toward mountain peaks I'd once known like old friends. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to leave marks, but something loosened in my chest as urban noise faded behind me. I parked at the same trailhead where I'd started hundreds of guided trips, the parking lot looking smaller than I remembered. Other vehicles sat scattered around the parking area, day hikers, maybe a few overnight campers heading to established sites. Normal people doing normal outdoor activities, unaware that something had been hunting in these woods for years. My pack felt weird after months away from the wilderness. I'd deliberately chosen minimal gear: lightweight tent, sleeping bag, basic cooking supplies, enough food for 3 days. No GPS device this time, just paper maps and a compass. If something happened to me out here, I didn't want to leave behind footage like David had. The trail climbed steadily through dense pine forest, each known landmark triggering memories of groups I'd guided through this same terrain. The switchback where Margaret had stopped to photograph wildflowers. The creek crossing where Emily had asked about bear safety. The ridge overlooked where David had checked his GPS and helped other hikers adjust their equipment. I'd planned to camp at least 5 miles from the site where the Martinez family had died, close enough to investigate the area but far enough to feel safer. The clearing I chose sat near a small creek, surrounded by tall pines that provided natural windbreaks and good sight lines in multiple directions. Setting up camp felt automatic, muscle memory taking over while my conscious mind checked the tree line for movement that didn't belong. The sun dropped behind the mountains earlier than I'd expected, shadows stretching across the campsite before I'd finished organizing my gear. I built a fire larger than necessary and kept it burning bright as darkness settled over the forest. Every sound made me freeze, branches creaking in the wind, small animals moving through bushes, the distant call of an owl somewhere deeper in the trees. I lay in my tent with my eyes open, listening to the night sounds that had once been as known as my own breathing. The wilderness felt different now, charged with potential threat that made every rustle of fabric or snapping twig seem like an approaching predator. My sleeping bag remained unzipped, boots within easy reach, flashlight gripped in one hand like a weapon. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual change from complete darkness to the faint gray light that came before dawn. The forest stayed normal throughout the long night. Typical sounds, natural rhythms, nothing to suggest I shared these mountains with anything more dangerous than bears and cougars. When morning finally arrived, I crawled out of my tent, feeling almost disappointed by how ordinary everything seemed. The creature I'd seen in that footage felt like a nightmare from another world. Something that couldn't possibly exist in the same mountains where I'd spent over a decade guiding families and weekend hikers. Maybe Detective Harris had been right about it being an isolated incident. Maybe the thing had been alone, a freak of nature that had since died or moved to hunting grounds hundreds of miles away. The research I'd conducted could have been coincidence. Missing hikers were nothing new in wilderness areas, and most disappearances had perfectly logical explanations involving falls, exposure, or getting lost. I made coffee over my camp stove and studied the maps spread across my sleeping bag, marking my current location and planning the day's exploration. The site where David Martinez had died lay roughly 3 miles northeast, accessible by established trails that would take me through known terrain. For the first time in 6 months, I almost convinced myself that whatever had killed the Martinez family was gone. I woke with my neck kinked from sleeping on uneven ground and a persistent ache in my lower back that reminded me how long I'd been away from camping. The fire had died to cold ash sometime during the night, leaving my campsite looking gray and abandoned in the early morning air. Coffee helped wash away the stale taste of anxiety that had coated my mouth since arriving yesterday. But it couldn't shake the feeling that I was wasting time sitting here when I should be investigating. After forcing down a granola bar that tasted like cardboard, I shouldered my day pack and checked my compass bearing. 3 miles northeast would take me to the creek where Emily Martinez had crouched in the mud 9 months ago, pointing at something that should have sent us all running in the opposite direction. The trail wound through terrain that I'd guided groups over dozens of times, but every landmark now carried weight it hadn't possessed before. The Douglas Fir, where I'd stopped to discuss wildlife safety with tourists. The rocky outcropping where families posed for photos with mountain peaks in the background. The meadow where children had chased butterflies while their parents adjusted pack straps and checked GPS coordinates. All of it looked the same, but my perception had changed completely. These weren't scenic waypoints anymore. They were potential hunting grounds. I moved carefully through the forest, stopping every few hundred yards to listen for sounds that didn't belong. Birds called from above, squirrels chattered at my intrusion, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against dead bark with mechanical persistence. Normal wilderness sounds that should have been comforting, but instead made me aware of how easily predators could mask their approach in the natural chaos. The creek came into view after an hour of steady hiking, its clear water tumbling over smooth stones exactly as I remembered. Nothing had changed about the basic geography. Same bend in the water, same cluster of fallen logs creating natural seats, same muddy bank where families had knelt to refill water bottles and wash trail dust from their faces.
But, as I approached the spot where Emily had made her discovery, my legs stopped moving without any conscious decision on my part. A footprint pressed deep into the soft earth near the water's edge, identical in every detail to the impression that had started this nightmare. 2 feet long, 8 inches wide, 5 distinct toe marks that looked almost human in their arrangement but scaled to impossible proportions. The edges remained sharp and clean, free of the weathering that would indicate an old impression. This print had been made recently, within the last day or two. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started taking photographs from multiple angles. Each image confirmed what my eyes were already telling me. The creature was still here, still moving through these mountains, still hunting. I knelt beside the print and placed my hiking boot next to it for scale, the way David Martinez had done with his phone 9 months earlier. My size 11 boot looked like a child's shoe compared to the massive impression. The depth suggested incredible weight, something heavy enough to sink nearly 4 inches into mud that barely registered my own footsteps. I understood then that all those missing hikers I'd researched during my 6 months of investigation had been real. The forum posts about destroyed campsites and unexplained disappearances. The patterns I'd mapped across British Columbia and Alberta. None of it had been coincidence or misidentification. There were more of them out there, and this one had never left its territory. Standing up too quickly made me dizzy, but I managed to take several more photos before backing away from the water's edge. That's when I noticed the other signs I'd been too focused on the footprint to see initially. Trees along the creek bank showed fresh damage. Bark scraped away in long vertical strips at heights no bear or cougar could reach. Some of the gouges started 8 feet up the trunk and continued down to chest level, as if something tall had marked its territory by raking claws along the bark. The scratches looked recent, with sap still oozing from the deepest cuts. A smell drifted on the morning breeze that made me gag. Not the clean decay of normal forest decomposition, but something sweet and rotten that suggested meat left too long in warm weather. The scent was faint, but distinct, coming from somewhere upstream where the creek disappeared around a bend thick with brush. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to investigate that smell, to document whatever I might find, and gather evidence that could save other hikers from the Martinez family's fate. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain recognized the trap. The same instinct that had kept me frozen in my tent months earlier when infant cries carried through the darkness now urged me to get as far away from this place as possible. I didn't bother hiking back to my campsite to break down the tent properly. Instead, I grabbed my sleeping bag, stuffed it into my pack along with whatever gear I could reach quickly, and started moving toward the trail that would take me back to civilization. The coffee pot and camp stove could stay where they were. None of it mattered compared to getting out of these mountains before whatever had made that print decided to investigate the unfamiliar scent of my presence. The trail seemed longer on the way out, each landmark taking forever to appear around the next bend. I forced myself to maintain a steady pace instead of running, knowing that panic would lead to twisted ankles or wrong turns that could trap me in the wilderness after dark. But urgency drove every step as I put distance between myself and that creek bank. I'd made it perhaps 2 miles when the sound started. An infant's cry carried through the forest behind me, high-pitched and desperate, carrying clearly through the still morning air, the same sound I'd heard that terrible night when I'd lain paralyzed in my sleeping bag. while something stalked through the darkness near my group's camp. But this time I was alone. No tourist to protect, no professional obligation to investigate distress calls, no pretense that this might be a real emergency requiring rescue response. Just me and the knowledge that whatever made that sound was aware of my presence and trying to lure me back toward the creek. I didn't look over my shoulder as I increased my pace toward the safety of the outside world. Some mysteries were better left unsolved,